When the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States had the largest navy in the world. It wasn't the most powerful navy. That distinction still belonged to Britain's Royal Navy, but measured simply by the number of ships in commission, the U.S. Navy was the biggest. Such a characterization requires an explanation, though. Most of the U.S. Navy warships that had served on blockade duty during the war were converted merchantmen, and they would have been all but helpless against a purpose-built warship of the Royal Navy or any other navy. The new ironclads were impressive, but they were not really capable of service on the open ocean, and the ships built for the River War couldn't operate on the oceans either. Even so, some Americans saw this as a moment of opportunity. Those who had long advocated a large, standing American Navy, the navalists, wondered if their time had come, if the U.S. Navy would now build on the foundation it had established during the Civil War and become a global naval power. Most Americans, however, wondered what would be the point of that. The war was over, thank God. And just as the Grand Army of the Republic was quickly demobilized afterward, it seemed logical to reduce the Navy too, to return it to what it had been before the war, a few score wooden steamers that could protect American trade in the far corners of the world. And that is pretty much what happened. In the 5 years after Lee surrendered at Appomattox, hundreds of the Navy's blockading ships were sold off, scrapped, or in a few cases simply abandoned. The ironclad monitors were laid up in ordinary, mothballed, if you will. And by 1870, the Navy that had numbered more than 600 warships in 1865 totaled only 52, most of them wooden-hulled. Though these ships had steam engines, they generally navigated from place to place under sail to conserve coal. Navalists decried this as short-sighted penny-pinching, and without a doubt, saving money was part of it. The Civil War had been hugely expensive. Government debt had exploded to 40 times its pre-war level. And with the war over, the popular view was that maintaining a large peacetime Navy was not only unnecessary, it was irresponsible. Then, too, in the years after Appomattox, the public's attention focused on other, quite different issues. One of them was the reconstruction of the Confederate South, both physical and political, a fraught and sometimes violent process that included the impeachment and trial of President Andrew Johnson and the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan. Another focus was the exploration and exploitation of the American West. The golden spike of the Transcontinental Railroad was hammered down at Promontory Point, Utah in 1869, symbolizing the connection of the two coasts. And in the 1870s, the only wars the public was interested in were those against the native tribes. No warships required. Absorbed by these issues during the decade and a half after the end of the Civil War, the United States retreated into its former isolation, and the U.S. Navy returned to its pre-war role of chasing pirates and chastising brigands who interfered with U.S. trade. Of course, there were occasional overseas disputes. In 1871, the administration of President Ulysses S. Grant sent 5 Navy ships to Korea under Civil War veteran Rear Admiral John Rodgers with instructions to open the so-called Hermit Kingdom to Western trade, much as Matthew Perry had opened Japan in 1853. It went wrong from the start. The Koreans declared that no foreign ship would be allowed to ascend the river leading to Incheon and Seoul without permission, when Rodgers nevertheless sent several small boats upriver to sound its depth. One of the Korean forts fired at them. Rodgers' ships fired back. 2 American sailors were wounded in the exchange. Rogers demanded an apology, and when it was not forthcoming, he landed 700 sailors and Marines, along with several pieces of artillery, to administer punishment. The landing party captured the Korean forts, losing only 3 men, while killing hundreds of the defenders, many of whom were armed with swords and spears. Having made his point, Rogers sailed away. He had indeed made his point, but of course he had also failed in his mission. It would be 7 years before a different American expedition secured a treaty with Korea. This event illustrates 2 characteristics of the U.S. Navy during the post-Civil War years. First, the determination of American naval officers to respond, often disproportionately, to any perceived insult to the flag, to American sailors, to America generally, especially if the perceived insult came from a relatively weak foe. Second, it is an example of the kind of discretion routinely exercised by naval officers on distant missions. Absent the ability to consult with political authorities in Washington, naval officers overseas could decide for themselves what actions deserved a military response and how much, though it was more complicated when the perceived transgressor was a European power. Other incidents during this era revealed how the absence of a robust modern Navy could limit the ways the nation could respond to a crisis. Here's an example. By 1868, Spain had lost almost all of its once vast American colonial empire to independence movements. Only Cuba and Puerto Rico still flew the Spanish flag. So when a Cuban independence movement broke out that year, Spain was determined to suppress it and retain this last vestige of its former greatness. Americans rooted for the Cubans. Some did more than that, offering money, arms, even themselves to support the movement. In 1873, 2 Americans purchased a side-wheel steamship named the Virginius, built initially as a Civil War blockade runner, and registered her as an American vessel. Their intent was to smuggle men, arms, and munitions to the rebels in Cuba. As her captain, they hired Joseph Fry, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, who had served in the Civil War as a Confederate naval officer. The Virginius's crew was a mixed bag of British and American citizens, some of whom may have been ignorant of the plan. A Spanish warship intercepted the Virginius at sea and took it to Santiago on Cuba's south coast, where Fry and his entire crew were quickly tried, condemned as pirates, and sentenced to be shot by firing squad. 53 of them, including Fry, were killed. When the news reached British authorities in nearby Jamaica, the British sloop of war Niobe steamed into Santiago Harbor, and her captain told the Spanish governor that if he carried out any more executions, the British would bombard the city. That stopped the executions, but of course it was too late to save the 53 who had already been killed. In the United States, news of the executions outraged Americans, especially after it was revealed that following the executions, the bodies of Fry and his crew had been decapitated and then trampled by cavalry. American newspapers clamored for war, and President Grant sent an ultimatum to Spain demanding, first, that the Virginius and any surviving crew members be immediately given up, second, that Spain apologize, and third, that the perpetrators of the executions, including the governor, be punished. Meanwhile, Grant ordered the Navy to mobilize. Well, that was easier said than done. The mothballed monitors were ordered to assemble at Key West, but their engines were old and rusted, And in any case, they had never been designed for service in the open ocean. As a result, the mobilization of the American fleet at Key West proved to be more of an embarrassment than a threat. In the end, the crisis was resolved without anyone firing a shot. Spain apologized, agreed to pay an indemnity to the families of the slain. The officer who had ordered the executions died before legal proceedings against him could take place. The public temperature cooled quickly to be replaced by other issues, including passage of the Ku Klux Klan Act. Yet the so-called Virginius affair in 1873 exposed to many the ill wisdom of failing to maintain a robust standing Navy, even in peacetime. Lacking a Navy that could pose a legitimate deterrent threat, American threats could safely be ignored. Here's another example. In 1893, the cruiser USS Baltimore made port at Valparaiso, Chile. Some American sailors who went ashore got into a fight with locals at a watering hole called the True Blue Saloon. It turned into a full-fledged riot, and 2 of the sailors were killed. The United States demanded an apology and reparations, but this time the Chilean government was defiant, blaming the riot on the sailors. The incident escalated until it seemed possible that the 2 countries might actually go to war. Once again, cooler heads prevailed, in part, perhaps, because Chile's Navy was actually larger and more powerful than that of the United States. To navalists, these incidents were humiliating. It was intolerable to them that the United States had to endure insolent behavior from either the Spanish colonials or Chilean government officials, never mind who started the fight. Anti-navalists saw it differently. If the United States had possessed a powerful ocean-going fleet, they noted, either incident might have led to war. But would that have been preferable to resolving the crises through negotiation? Perhaps having a large and powerful fleet was as dangerous as not having one. Whatever the answer to that, the tide began to turn in favor of a larger and more robust United States Navy, even before the incident at the True Blue Saloon. The first manifestation of it came in 1881, when Secretary of the Navy William H. Hunt asked Congress for appropriations to build 4 new steel-hulled warships. His objective was not to enlarge the Navy so much as it was a recognition that the Navy's old wooden-hulled ships were wearing out. Congress agreed, and the result was what were called the ABCD ships, because the first letter in their names, Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, and the dispatch ship Dolphin, spelled out ABCD. They were a significant improvement on the ships they replaced. In addition to a double steel hull, they had watertight compartments and were fully equipped with electricity so that instead of sailors carrying oil lanterns below decks to see where they were going, they could now flip a switch. The 3 cruisers were well armed with 2 8-inch guns and 6 6-inch guns. Yet it was not quite a naval revolution. For one thing, the new ships retained a traditional appearance with a full set of masts and spars. For another, their intended function was pretty much the same as the ships they replaced: to protect overseas trade and guard U.S. interests in the far corners of the world. In short, they were a new tool designed to do the usual jobs more efficiently. More substantive change was coming, however. That same year, 1886, Congress authorized the construction of 2 battleships to be named Maine and Texas, thus establishing the precedent that battleships were to be named for states, while cruisers, like the Atlanta, Boston, and Chicago, were named for cities. a tradition that continued through the end of the Second World War. The act that authorized these first two battleships of the United States Navy described them as seagoing coastline battleships, which is almost an oxymoron. Such a designation was intended to assuage suspicious anti-navalists who feared that building battleships would draw the United States into foreign wars. No, 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 advocates of the bill insisted. These were coastline battleships to protect America's ports and harbors. If these additions to the Navy in the 1880s did not constitute a true revolution, one was coming nonetheless. In part, it was driven by the simple fact that the West, which had captured the American imagination for a decade, was filling up. The 1890 census reported that there was no longer any part of the continental United States that could properly be considered a frontier. So some Americans began to look outward for a new frontier. American merchants, in particular, were beguiled by the prospect of increased trade with the Far East, and especially China. Already, the United States had annexed the tiny atoll of Midway in the Central Pacific, which was a useful coaling station for vessels headed to the Far East. Another significant milestone in the coming naval renaissance was the founding in 1884 of the U.S. Naval War College at Newport, Rhode Island. The purpose of the new school was to prepare middle-grade Navy officers for high command responsibility by encouraging them to think strategically, even globally, as well as tactically. A central figure in the transformation of the U.S. Navy during the 1890s was Navy Captain and later Rear Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan. The son of a well-known professor at West Point, Dennis Hart Mahan, the younger Mahan was an otherwise undistinguished naval officer who had written a book about the Navy in the Civil War called The Gulf and Inland Waters. That encouraged Rear Admiral Stephen B. Luce, who was the founder and president of the Naval War College, to invite him to become one of the college's first instructors. Mahan worked up a series of lectures focusing on the history of the Royal Navy in the 17th and 18th centuries. His central argument was that Britain had emerged from that era as a great world power because her fleet of ships of the line, the battleships of their day, defeated her maritime rivals, Holland and France, giving Britain command of the sea and the wealth and power that resulted. In 1890, he collected these lectures into a book, which he called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. Though much of the book deals, rather tediously, I must confess, with the tactics of various naval battles, his central theme was that a dominant battleship fleet brought its possessor command of the sea, from which everything else followed: colonies, trade, wealth, and ultimately power. It was both a description of the past and a roadmap for the future. Mahan's timing was perfect. With the United States in the midst of a national reassessment and a naval revival, here was a book that explained and justified what was happening. Rather remarkably, it became a bestseller, was translated into several foreign languages, including German and Japanese, and became required reading for naval officers around the world. It did not cause the naval revolution, but it offered an explanation and a justification for changes that were already underway. The same year that Mahan's book appeared, Congress authorized 3 more battleships, the Indiana, Massachusetts, and Oregon. By 1897, the U.S. Navy had 6 modern battleships. The United States now had a Navy that was capable of responding if another crisis occurred. And of course, one did. The Cuban Revolution of 1868 sputtered out a decade later in 1878, but it erupted again in 1895, inspired by the poet, philosopher, and Cuban nationalist José Martí. Spain, determined to quash the uprising, sent General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba as Governor General with full powers to do whatever was necessary. He did his best. Indeed, Weyler initiated many of the tactics we now associate with anti-insurgency warfare. He rounded up citizens in the countryside and moved them into protected camps, a policy he called Reconcentrado, which is where the term concentration camp comes from. He was also ruthless against captured rebels. His policies were so harsh, they turned much of the populace against him. In the United States, where popular sympathy lay with the rebels, American newspapers labeled Weyler the Butcher and embarked on a style of reporting since labeled yellow journalism that emphasized the cruelty of the Spanish regime and the suffering of the Cuban people. An example is a snippet from a column in the New York World on May 17, 1896, which reads as follows. No man's life, no man's property is safe. American citizens are imprisoned or slain without cause. American property is destroyed on all sides. There is no pretense at protecting it. Millions and millions of dollars worth of American sugarcane, buildings, and machinery has been lost. This year alone, the war will strike $68 million from the commerce of the United States. Wounded soldiers can be found begging in the streets of Havana. Cuba will soon be a wilderness of blackened ruins. This year, there is little to live upon. Next year, there will be nothing. The horrors of a barbarous struggle for the extermination of the native population is witnessed on all sides. Blood on the roadsides, blood on the fields, blood on the doorsteps, blood, blood, blood. The old, the young, the weak, the crippled, all are butchered without mercy. There is scarcely a hamlet that has not witnessed this dreadful war. Is there no nation wise enough, brave enough to aid this smitten land? Well, yes, there was. And it was not only wise and brave, it now had a big navy. Under tremendous public pressure, President McKinley approved sending a battleship to Havana to signal American concern. It was the USS Maine. Anchored in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, the Maine suddenly exploded. 260 American sailors were killed, and the ship was a total loss. Today, we are pretty sure how it happened. Like all other steamships at the time, the Maine was fueled by coal, and coal dust is extraordinarily volatile. A single spark, even from a nail in a boot heel striking a steel plate, could trigger an explosion. Such explosions had occurred frequently in coal mines and occasionally in the bunkers of steamships. Almost certainly it is what happened to the Maine. An investigation of the wreck site years later showed the flanges of the hull were bent outward from an internal explosion. But no one in 1898 wanted to hear that. To Americans, it was patently obvious that the wicked Spanish were to blame. Like other newspapers in the United States, the New York Journal insisted that the explosion was the work of an enemy, and even carried an illustration on its front page showing a Spanish mine deployed beneath the Maine. President McKinley sought to tamp down the public and editorial outrage, but the pressure was too great. He issued an ultimatum demanding that Spain end its war against the Cuban rebels, and when Spain rejected it, he asked Congress for the authority to intervene. Spain responded with a declaration of war. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked the moment the United States Navy emerged as a global naval power. Spain's Navy was not inconsequential, but it was much older than America's brand new steam and steel Navy. The result was a swift American victory, punctuated by two naval battles, one on each side of the world. The first of these took place almost as far from Cuba as it was possible to get. Mahan's book had emphasized the importance, indeed the necessity, of destroying an enemy's main battle fleet in order to command the sea. And Spain had two fleets, one in Cadiz, Spain, the other in Manila Bay in the Philippines. As a result of the perceived need to neutralize Spain's Asian fleet, orders went out from the Navy Department, written by Assistant Navy Secretary and future President Theodore Roosevelt, for the American Asiatic Squadron to keep full of coal, and if hostilities began, to attack the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. The recipient of those orders was Commodore George Dewey, who Roosevelt had handpicked for the assignment. In the early hours of May 1st, 1898, Dewey led his ships into Manila Bay. He expected to find the Spanish fleet anchored near the city of Manila, where they could be supported by the heavy guns of the citadel. But the Spanish commander, Rear Admiral Don Patricio Montojo y Pasaron, in order to avoid putting civilian lives at risk, instead anchored his small fleet across the bay near the Spanish Navy Yard. Dewey immediately attacked him there. The ensuing battle was a gun duel between armored cruisers. The American ships passed back and forth in front of the anchored Spanish vessels, fired as fast as they could. American gunnery was poor. Afterward, it was discovered that of the 9,500 shells fired by the American ships, only 123 of them actually struck a target. But Spanish marksmanship was worse. In the end, the firepower of the American ships overwhelmed the Spanish. The Spanish fought with determination. Some of the gunners on their ships continued to fire, even as the ships sank beneath them. Nevertheless, by the afternoon, all of the Spanish ships were either sunk or captured. It was the most complete American naval victory since Oliver Hazard Perry won the Battle of Lake Erie back in 1813. Dewey had fulfilled his mission of destroying the Spanish fleet. But now what? He could simply have sailed away, but he didn't. Instead, he remained in Manila Bay and sent a request to Washington for an army of occupation. That request changed American history, for it was the first small step toward an American overseas empire. The second naval battle of the Spanish-American War took place in Cuban waters. When the war began, Spain sent its home fleet under Admiral Pascual Cervera across the Atlantic from Cadiz to Cuba, and after a stop in Curaçao, it ended up in the commodious harbor of Santiago on Cuba's south coast. Almost at once, a larger American squadron under Admiral William T. Sampson arrived to blockade him there. The harbor entrance was too narrow and well protected for Sampson to force an entrance. So, to compel Cervera to leave, an American army under Major General William R. Shafter landed 15 miles down the coast at Daiquiri and approached Santiago overland. The most famous unit in Shafter's army was the so-called Rough Riders, with the former Assistant Navy Secretary, Theodore Roosevelt, as second in command. When the American Army, including the Rough Riders, captured the high ground of San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill outside Santiago, Cervera realized he had to make a break for it or be captured at anchor. He saw an opportunity when Sampson took his flagship, the USS New York, away from the blockade to confer with Shafter off Daiquiri. Sampson's second in command was Rear Admiral Winfield Scott Schley, and when he saw Cervera coming out of the harbor entrance, heading directly for his ship, the Brooklyn, he assumed it was a torpedo attack. He ordered a sharp turn to starboard, that is to the east, to avoid it. But Cervera turned west. Instead of reversing his rudder, Schley continued his starboard turn until he had completed a full circle and then headed after him. Swiftly returning from Daiquiri, Sampson too joined the chase, and over the next several hours, the newer and faster American ships caught up with the slower Spanish ships and destroyed them one by one. It was a victory at least as complete as Dewey's at Manila. It also sowed the seeds of a bitter dispute. Schley's critics began whispering that his initial starboard turn, as Cervera approached, was simple cowardice. He had run away from the enemy. Schley was infuriated. He demanded a court-martial to clear his name. Officers took sides as the dispute became public, and instead of basking in an historic victory, the Navy was embarrassed by a squalid and unseemly public feud that lasted for years. Eventually, Theodore Roosevelt, by now President Roosevelt, stepped in to order everyone to shut up. The Spanish-American War was, in the words of McKinley's Secretary of State John Hay, a splendid little war. And it was an extraordinary debut for the new U.S. Navy, which enjoyed two swift, utterly one-sided, and for the Americans at least, nearly bloodless victories. The war was also a turning point for the country. Although the initial U.S. declaration of war against Spain had forsworn any territorial ambitions in Cuba, a subsequent amendment set strict conditions for the removal of American forces from the island. And soon afterward, the United States secured an indefinite lease on Guantanamo Bay on Cuba's south coast. The treaty that ended the war, yet another called the Treaty of Paris, also transferred control of both Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States and allowed the United States to purchase the Philippines for $20 million. All that territorial acquisition overseas changed more than the world map. By 1900, the United States had become a global power, and there was no going back.